This week's topic is, well, we'll get into it actually. So imagine the world 100 years ago. Imagine what it would be like, what your life would be like if you just happened to be born in the year 1921. If you looked around the world and you looked at the richest countries, the most wealthy countries, best off, the average life expectancy would be around just 55 years old. Also, if you looked at other measures, such as how much freedom you would have, you'd see that 7 in 1 countries are actually autocratic. And if you compare that to today, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio between autocracies and democracies. If you looked at education, back then, 100 years ago, the literacy rate globally was about 31%. And now it's about 86%. So one other thing you would notice is that since 100 years ago, and even longer than that, we've been on this exponential climb with regards to incomes. So back 100 years ago, most people lived under $2 a day, whereas now we have a very large percentage of the population who does not, and most of us live on much more than that. So this could lead you to the claim that Max Roser from University of Oxford makes, which is that behind all these progresses is this common thread of economic growth. What economic growth makes possible is that everybody can become better off, even when the number of people that need to be served by the economy increases. And that leads us into our question for today, which is, what about long-term economic growth as an EA cause area? So we talk about EA as using evidence and reason to find the very best ways to do good in the world, to take action on that basis. Let's debate for the next 10 minutes this question of considering long-term economic growth as one of many other EA causes. And also ask yourself the question, might it even be possible or rather, might it be preferable to prioritize economic growth over other EA causes? So just as a quick roadmap, I want to start out looking at one case for long-term economic growth. And I'll be borrowing a lot of the material from an interview from Tyler Cohen, misspelled his last name there, and Rob Wiblin, and then looking at some possible implications and some challenges to these views. So starting out with Tyler Cohen. Cohen is an economist at George Mason, and Rob Wiblin is one of the managers at 80,000 Hours. They had a wonderful conversation. A podcast has been produced over it where they talk about Cohen's new book, Stubborn Attachments. With Cohen essentially makes this argument that well, let me spell it out for you. First, he says, our top moral priority should be preserving and improving humanity's long-term future. So he is somewhat of a long-termist, actually. I wouldn't associate him with some of the other causes that long-termists and EAs are concerned about, but Cohen definitely is concerned about long-termism. And one aspect of this is he argues that when economists use discount rates, we should be thinking of 0 or near 0 discount rates, which is something that most economists don't do. A second aspect of Cohen's claim is that the best way to preserve or improve humanity's long-term future is to maximize the rate of sustainable economic growth. He does note that while we do this, we should respect human rights and follow general principles. So you can think of examples in the past where we saw economic growth or capital mobilization in ways that simply were not respecting human rights. I'm thinking of many communist regimes here, and Cohen would definitely not be supportive of that. So I want to just dive a little bit deeper into Cohen's case. I think it'll be instructive. The first point I think one large point he makes throughout his work is that exponential growth is massively important. And this is for many of us who maybe get really nerdy about the numbers, this is kind of like something that doesn't seem too shocking. But you can look at examples of economic growth in an exponential way that really prove this point. So if you look at the difference between the US and Mexico today, if you were to go back 100 years ago and start from one place and have 1 or 2% more growth per year, that would constitute the difference between the US economy today and the Mexican economy today. Just a small amount every year can make the difference between this skyline and this skyline. It's a bit of an unfair image here, but just to prove the point that small incremental improvements over time have massive dividends. We know that's true in investing and whatnot, but it's true with economic growth and with societies in their progress. The next point that Cohen makes is that more wealth is equal to more of other good things. One big thing he mentions is stability. So countries that have more wealth are able to protect that wealth and also protect themselves from other countries who might want their destruction. So wealthier countries have better, generally speaking, better legal systems, but also better national defense. And there's many other spillover effects, if you will. So various other things that you might care about. Maybe you're not so concerned about the wealth itself, but maybe you're concerned about diversity or liberty or other aesthetic values and art and culture. These all tend to come in societies where there's more wealth. And a final point in Cohen's case for economic growth is that it's not guaranteed. Growth is driven by things like favorable institutions, things like entrepreneurs pursuing innovation, technological innovation as well. And if we think about the next 100 years, 200 years or so forth, it's not clear if we're going to have the same kind of economic growth. At least this growth would be threatened by rising debt levels like here in the US, corruption and rent seeking on a global scale, power conflicts, as well as complacency on a much more micro level. Less people now are opening businesses. Less people now are, there's actually quite a lot of interesting talk about how there's maybe less technological innovation now and startups now, despite the growing media attention on what tech startups there are. So I want to move on to some possible implications if you were to agree with Cohen here, and to cite Cohen on these implications, which touches on, I think, some EA considerations quite closely. He says, I do think you have an obligation to act in accordance with maximizing the growth rate of GDP. But given how human beings are built, that's mostly going to involve leading a pretty selfish life, trying to earn more, having a family, raising your children well. It's close to in sync with common sense morality, which to me is a plus in my argument. So what it's telling you to do doesn't sound so crazy. You don't have to re-engineer human nature. So if someone from a more Peter Singer direction says, well, all doctors should have to run off to Africa, people won't do that. We can't and we shouldn't coerce them into doing that. The notion that by living a good life, but making some improvements at the margin, that's what you're obliged to do. I find that very appealing. It's like change at the margin, small steps towards a much better world. So you might say something like, an implication is you have this moral obligation to maximize GDP over the long run. That might look like adopting more of a growth mindset in your life, or just saving and investing, or having children, or promoting innovation, maybe yourself or others who might do that, or promoting good institutions. And that can be something really broad, promoting rule of law, or just promoting good practices in your communities, but maybe also on a global scale. I want to just quickly address here for 2 minutes some challenges that might come up with this view. So the first is biblical challenges. So we see, we see in Scripture dangers about prioritizing material wealth over spiritual wealth. There's also a phenomenon where countries that become wealthier actually become less religious. I don't remember what survey people usually point to here, but I know there are several, and here's just one I found recently, this might be from Pew, but you can see quite here this negative relationship between having more wealth and being less spiritual. I know the Pope has cited this phenomenon as well. And we have verses in scriptures such as lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, but lay for yourselves treasures in heaven, where no rust destroys, nor thieves steal, right? And the more we think about, you might argue, the more we think about gaining material wealth, the less we think about spiritual values, the importance of people giving their lives and their hearts over to God. And as Christians, you might ask, should we be talking about money, or should we be talking more about God, right? If we can't talk about both in every breath, which one do we talk about? So there's a broad theme of challenges there. There are also additional challenges related to whether higher economic growth is really an effective way to safeguard humanity's future, or the most effective way to safeguard humanity's future. Maybe our focus should be somewhere else. Maybe there are more neglected areas. I can think of many EA long-termists who would think that things like stopping AI risks or stopping nuclear war would be even more valuable than ensuring economic growth. And we can talk about these things, how much these things are related or how much they're separate and so forth. So I want to leave us with these challenges and send us off into breakout rooms. I don't have questions written down, but I would encourage you to discuss, do you agree with Cohen's arguments, or do you disagree, or somewhere in between? How do you view economic growth with regards to other EA causes, like more immediate reductions of poverty or sickness and disease in developing countries, or take animal welfare or some other concerns?